forest was quiet except for the low rumble of thunder rolling in the distance. Mark crouched near the lynx, his hands steady on the ground. The animal's chest rose shallowly, each breath strained, but still there. He kept his face close, not to touch, but to see the faint movement of whiskers with every exhale. He whispered soft words, not because the lynx could understand, but because his own voice anchored him against panic. He pulled off his jacket, spreading it wide and propping it against a fallen branch to shield the lynx from the wind that swept down the slope. The sky had turned a darker gray. He glanced upward and then back at the animal. The eyes of the lynx stayed half-closed, ears unmoving. Mark swallowed hard. His phone screen showed no bars. He had tried already, pacing the rocky slope, raising it to the sky. Nothing. He took a breath, stood, and jogged downslope through tangled roots until the signal bars flickered on. His fingers shook as he tapped the number Ben had given him. The ranger answered fast. Mark forced his voice steady, explaining the injuries, the location, the breathing. Ben told him to keep calm, to avoid moving the animal, and to make noise if bears or coyotes came close. Help was on the way, but the terrain would slow them. Mark listened, nodding even though the ranger couldn't see him, and repeated the instructions aloud as if cementing them in his own head. He climbed back to the lynx, chest tight with dread. Kneeling again, he placed his hand just above the soil near the animal's nose. The weak puff of air brushed his fingers. Relief and fear collided inside him. He spoke low, telling the lynx that help was coming, though he didn't know if he believed it himself. Minutes dragged like hours. The thunder grew louder, the wind sharper. Mark adjusted the jacket, pressing stones at the corners to hold it. He sat with his back against the rock, eyes darting between the lynx and the storm clouds sliding overhead. Each time the animal's breath caught, his own lungs froze. A crack of thunder burst closer, rattling the branches. Mark whispered again, steadying both of them. In the distance, a faint echo of voices carried through the trees. Relief sparked, but he stayed still, afraid any sudden move might frighten the fragile creature clinging to life before him. The morning came gray and wet after the storm. Mark stood near the transport crate as the team carried the lynx into the small wildlife clinic. The air inside smelled of disinfectant and damp fur. He stepped aside when Dr. Laura Hayes entered, pulling on gloves with quick movements. Her face was calm but focused, the kind of expression that carried both authority and weight. Ben gave her a brief report of what they had seen on the mountain. She knelt by the crate and studied the lynx, her hands moving with practiced caution. Dehydrated. Shallow breathing. Possible broken rib. We need fluids and x-rays immediately. Her tone was clipped, clinical, as though she had said these words countless times before. Mark watched as the animal was lifted onto the table. A mask slid gently over the lynx's muzzle, and the slow hiss of oxygen filled the room. The monitor beeped irregularly, tracing every fragile heartbeat. Dr. Hayes pressed along the rib cage, her eyes narrowing. Severe bruising. Will stabilize first, surgery only if absolutely necessary. Daniel Brooks from the Wildlife Service stood at the doorway, his notebook in hand. Remember, this animal stays wild. No unnecessary contact, no attempts to domesticate. If recovery isn't likely, we have to consider the humane option. His words landed heavy. Mark clenched his fists but said nothing. Hours blurred as fluids dripped through tubing and the team moved between machines. At one point, Dr. Hayes asked for silence as she checked the breathing again. Mark held his breath until she nodded slightly. Still alive, still fighting. Later, in the hallway, Mark finally spoke. We can't give up. She was still breathing when I found her. She's still breathing now. There has to be a chance. Dr. Hayes studied him, then replied evenly. We don't decide by hope, Mark. We decide by numbers and response. Tonight will tell us more than words can. By evening, the clinic grew quiet, the storm outside replaced by a steady drizzle. Mark sat on a chair near the observation window, watching the slow rise and fall of the lynx's chest. The heat lamps glowed over her body, but the monitor numbers dipped, climbing only to slip again. Each drop felt like a punch to his chest. Near midnight, Dr. Hayes adjusted the blankets and shook her head. If the temperature falls further, we delay everything. She won't survive anesthesia in this state. All we can do is wait. Mark pressed his forehead against the glass. Waiting felt unbearable, but it was all that remained. Every beep of the monitor became a question. Would the lynx hold on through the night? Or would the fight end before help could truly begin? A week later, the clinic smelled less like panic and more like disinfectant, hay, and the faint musk of animals. The lynx lay in a reinforced enclosure, her foreleg wrapped in a firm splint, her sides rising with steadier breaths. She was not strong, but she was stable, and every small shift of her chest reassured Mark more than words could. He stood just outside the mesh, his hands clasped together, trying to keep from leaning in. Megan Reed, the volunteer coordinator, watched him with a sharp eye that missed nothing. "Rule 1, she said firmly, her voice carrying authority. "Minimal contact. You don't look her in the eyes, you don't talk to her like she's a pet. Your job is to keep her wild, not tame her." Mark nodded, lowering his gaze. "Got it. Distance. No talking." The words sounded awkward in his mouth, but he meant them. Megan handed him a box of branches cut from nearby pines. "Put these along the back wall. She needs cover, something that feels like her forest. Do it slow and don't make sudden noise. Even the smallest startle can set her back." Mark stepped inside cautiously, the door creaking faintly behind him. His boots scuffed lightly on the concrete floor as he placed each branch against the wall. The lynx shifted once, her ears twitching, but she didn't lift her head. For a moment, he thought she might bolt, but she sank back against the pine needles spread on the ground. He worked quickly but carefully, then stepped out, closing the gate with a soft click. Relief ran through him when Megan gave a short approving nod. Next came the feeding protocol. Megan showed him the chute system. Food slid down a metal channel into the enclosure. No hands inside. No human presence when the animal ate. "If she links you with food, we fail," Megan reminded him. Mark repeated the steps back to her until she was satisfied, his voice flat but steady. Later, when he watched the lynx take the food silently, his chest ached with the urge to say something encouraging, but he bit his tongue and stayed still. The days took on a rhythm. He arrived early, cleaned quietly, checked the cameras mounted on posts, and logged any changes in behavior on the clipboard Megan gave him. Sometimes he noticed the lynx pacing in short, stiff circles. Sometimes she lay still under the pine branches, her amber eyes half closed. Megan explained the signs. Pacing meant anxiety, stillness meant conserving strength. He wrote notes, clumsy at first, then sharper, learning to record every detail like the staff expected. In between tasks, Mark learned from overheard conversations. Veterinarians debated pain levels, staff whispered about budget strains, and volunteers traded shifts like soldiers on duty. It was a world built on patience and precision, one he had never imagined before finding the lynx under that cliff. He began to realize how fragile the line was between success and failure, not just for the animal, but for the people working behind the scenes. Yet outside the gates, tension brewed louder each day. A local news post online carried a headline: "Wildlife Center hand feeds predator near farms." The story spun details into something threatening, ignoring the protocols and barriers. Comments poured in, some accusing the center of putting people and livestock at risk. Mark overheard staff muttering about angry calls from residents, about meetings with county officials. Tom Walker, a farmer from down the valley, had already called twice demanding to know why money was being spent to keep a hunter alive instead of protecting cattle. One afternoon, Mark joined Ben to install another camera near the far edge of the enclosure. The metal pole wobbled as Mark steadied it, while Ben tightened the bolts with calm efficiency. "People don't see the full picture," Ben said, grunting as he worked. "They just see claws and teeth. They don't see the balance she's part of. They don't see the rodents she keeps down or the health of the forest she helps maintain." Mark nodded, but the weight of the hostility outside the fence clung to him. For every calm word here, there seemed to be 10 angry voices out there. That evening, a meeting gathered in the staff office. Megan laid maps on the table, pointing to the original release site. "We plan to send her back here, near the ridge where she fell. It's part of her range." But she paused, sliding a new report forward. Satellite images showed smoke and blackened lines stretching across the forest. "A brush fire burned through last night. Her range is gone." The room fell silent. Dr. Hayes folded her arms, her jaw tight, and Daniel tapped his pen against the table, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Megan's fingers circled other areas on the map, but each had problems. Too close to farms, too few prey, or heavy human activity. Mark stared at the satellite images, a pit opening in his stomach. Every option carried risk. The question no one wanted to speak finally hung in the air. If not there, then where could they send her now? The lynx was healing, growing stronger by the day. But strength meant little without a place to belong. 2 weeks later, the air around the center carried the smell of late spring grass and distant smoke. The lynx had gained weight, her coat sleek again, her eyes sharper. She moved with measured steps inside the enclosure, testing her leg against the ground, crouching low before rising with surprising strength. It was time to plan her release. The staff gathered around a larger map in the office. Red markers showed burned areas, black lines traced old fire breaks, and green circles marked possible ranges. Megan pointed at a valley north of the ridge. It's further from where she fell, but the habitat is stable. Prey density is high, and human activity is limited. Daniel leaned forward, tapping his pen. Limited isn't none. Tom Walker's farm sits less than 3 miles from that edge. If she heads south, his livestock is the first thing she'll find. Tom sat stiffly in a folding chair, arms crossed. His face was sunburned from field work, his jaw tight. That's exactly my problem. You put her there. You're putting her on my doorstep. Dr. Hayes spoke calmly. Tom, we'll mitigate the risk. That means stronger fencing, night lights on the perimeter, and reinforced pens for smaller animals. We're also going to show you tools you can use to deter predators without harming them. Tom grunted. Tools don't stop hunger. Ben placed a folder on the table. They help. We've trialed them with coyotes and bears. Motion lights trigger, dogs carry bells, and loud deterrents push predators back into cover. It's not perfect, but it reduces conflict. Mark listened, shifting in his chair. He could feel Tom's frustration, the sharp edge of a man who worked land for years and didn't trust outsiders. But he also remembered the lynx's breath against his hand, faint but stubborn. Both lives, the farmer's work and the animal's survival, demanded respect. Later that day, the group drove out to Tom's farm. Wooden fences stretched along the pasture, weathered and leaning. Ben walked with Tom, pointing out weak posts and loose boards. These are where she could slip through if she comes close. Reinforcing them now saves headaches later. Megan showed Tom a portable light system that triggered when animals crossed sensors. She set one up by the chicken coop, and when Mark walked past, the floodlight burst on, scattering the birds inside. Tom raised an eyebrow. Bright enough. Might scare off my cows too. Dr. Hayes added, cows adjust. Predators don't. In the late afternoon sun, Tom agreed to let the center install the systems. He remained wary, but the tension eased when Mark helped carry new lumber to the fence line. Tom watched him work and finally muttered, You care about this animal, don't you? Mark paused, resting the lumber on the post. I care about giving her a chance. Same as I'd want if I were down and someone found me. Tom said nothing more, but his shoulders loosened. Back at the center, preparations continued. The lynx was sedated briefly so a GPS collar could be fitted snug around her neck. Mark held his breath as Dr. Hayes checked the strap twice. This will ping her location every few hours. We'll monitor her movement. Make sure she doesn't linger near farms. When the lynx woke, she paced once around the enclosure, shaking her head against the new weight, then settled under the pine boughs. Mark felt a jolt in his chest. The wild was waiting for her, and she knew it. On release day, the team loaded the transport crate into a truck. Mark rode in the back with Ben, his hands pressed against the wooden slats. The road wound through green valleys scarred with black patches of burned forest. Birds scattered as the truck rattled over gravel. They reached the chosen site by mid-morning. Trees rose tall around a clearing, the smell of char still faint but the undergrowth alive with new shoots. The crate was set down, and everyone stepped back. The door lifted, slow and careful. For a moment the lynx stayed still, eyes scanning the open world. Then she stepped forward, one paw, then another, and finally slipped into the brush without sound. Mark exhaled, realizing he had been holding his breath. The forest seemed to breathe with him. Hours later, in the monitoring room, the first signals from the collar appeared on the screen. A steady ping every few hours, tracing a line north into the valley. Relief swept the group. But near nightfall, the signals stuttered, then went dark. The screen showed only a blinking icon and silence. Daniel frowned. That zone's notorious for poor reception. Ben nodded. but his eyes were fixed on the screen. Outside, the wind rose sharply, rattling the windows, carrying with it the scent of smoke from distant fires. Megan stood quickly, grabbing her jacket. "We need to check the last known point before the storm cuts the roads." Mark followed without hesitation, his heart pounding. The lynx was out there, and now the forest itself was shifting. Almost a month had passed since the release, and the valley had begun to shift into early summer. Grasses pushed up through the blackened soil where fire had scorched the hillsides, and young shoots painted green lines against the gray. The air smelled of earth warming again, but for the team at the center, unease lingered. The GPS collar had gone silent the night of the storm, and since then, every attempt to reacquire a steady signal had failed. They relied instead on the old ways: boots on the ground, eyes scanning the treeline, and camera traps set along game trails. Mark walked those trails daily with Ben, carrying packs filled with batteries, memory cards, and scent-free gloves. He had learned to move quieter, to recognize the V-shaped indent of a deer hoof versus the rounder pad of a coyote. And sometimes he saw what he was most desperate to find: the wide, oval track of a lynx paw pressed into soft mud. Each print sent a rush of relief through him, proof she was still alive, still moving. The first breakthrough came from a camera trap set deep in a ravine. Megan retrieved the card, slid it into the laptop, and the screen lit with a sequence of images. At first there were rabbits darting past, then a raccoon nosing the ground. And then, at midnight, the lynx appeared. Her body was lean but not gaunt, her splinted leg fully unwrapped now, the stride smooth and balanced. In the last frame, she leapt into the brush with a hair clamped in her jaws. The room erupted with quiet cheers, relief flooding through the tension that had been building for weeks. Dr. Hayes exhaled and leaned back in her chair. "She's hunting. That's the best sign we could ask for." Daniel still made notes, practical as always. "We'll confirm territory range before declaring her established. But yes, this is strong evidence." Mark stared at the screen longer than the others, tracing her outline with his eyes. For weeks he had imagined the worst: trapped, starving, lost. But here she was, alive and strong, surviving as she was meant to. The following days the team checked more cameras. One caught her at dawn crossing a ridge, dew shining on her coat. Another showed her crouched low in tall grass, eyes fixed ahead. Each sighting built a picture of resilience. Mark didn't need anyone to explain. The images spoke on their own. She had found her rhythm again. Toward the end of the month, Mark accompanied Ben and Daniel on a long hike into a stretch of forest north of Tom's farm. They climbed a ridge, the sky wide above, the valley stretching out below. Ben paused, lifting his hand. "Tracks," he said, pointing to faint impressions in the soil. The three followed the trail carefully, hearts tight with anticipation. At a bend where the trees opened, Mark froze. There, across the clearing, the lynx stood. She was half hidden by tall grass, ears perked, her gaze fixed on something beyond them. For a moment their eyes nearly met, though distance kept the encounter safe. She didn't limp, didn't falter. With one silent bound, she vanished into the undergrowth. Mark's throat tightened, words failing him. Ben placed a hand on his shoulder. "That's all we needed," he said quietly. "Proof she's back where she belongs." Back at the center, the focus shifted from her alone to the larger picture. Megan expanded the education program, inviting farmers and residents to workshops on coexistence. Lights and bells were distributed with guides on how to use them effectively. Tom himself attended one session, arms crossed at first, but by the end asking about maintenance for the lights. Small steps, but steps nonetheless. Dr. Hayes updated her notes, satisfied with the progress. Daniel filed his reports with cautious optimism, recommending more monitoring. And Mark, after weeks of volunteering, was formally added to the roster. He was given responsibility for coordinating camera placements near farms, a role that tied him to both sides of the struggle, the people needing protection and the animals needing space. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the valley in gold, Mark sat outside the center, the sounds of birds folding into night. He thought of the lynx somewhere out there, moving through brush, hunting, breathing free. He thought of Tom checking fence lights, of Megan teaching volunteers, of the slow, fragile work of building trust. The lynx had returned to her forest, and the people, in their own way, were learning to live alongside her. It was not perfect, never would be, but it was enough to carry forward. Mark let the quiet settle around him, the weight of the past weeks easing. Every person had done their part, and the wild, at least for now, had held its place.